Mass Effect Andromeda launched on March 21st, 2017, and I played the game again to see if, and answer the question, is it worth playing this year in 2023? So let's find out.
Lockhart QT.
When Mass Effect Andromeda came out, it was met with memes, glitch videos, mixed reviews, basically on the spectrum of fans who thought it was okay and were optimistic of it getting better, or fans who were just filled with blood-curdling rage and just wanted the game to be cancelled and all the rest of it. As fans of bioware and the casual audience all had extremely high hopes for the next instalment of the Mass Effect series, as Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3 are some of the most beloved games of all time. But when the game launched, it was clearly rushed out by EA and bioware, with lots of bugs, glitches, terrible facial animations, and a story that was just not as good as the original trilogy. The game's launch was so bad that in fact, the Mass Effect series as a whole was actually put on ice by EA and BioWare due to its terrible reception at launch, with thankfully the franchise being revived now and with another installment coming in the future, so thankfully Andromeda wasn't that bad that it completely killed the franchise. Not only that, but the game had story DLC which was intended but ultimately scrapped early in development, extremely early in development, to the point where it wasn't even, so the story wasn't even written, and the Quarian arc was actually put as a novel rather than adapted into an in-game DLC, but that's a whole nother video and a whole nother story for another day. Mass Effect Andromeda takes place during the ending of Mass Effect 2, and sees the Andromeda Initiative arcs flying through space to colonise new worlds. Basically, the humans, the Alliance in general, wanted to actually get away from the Reaper threat which was imminent in Mass Effect 3, so they created the arcs, put people in cryostasis, and basically sent them to Andromeda to hopefully survive. The game starts with our custom character being Ryder, waking up 600 years later and from cryosleep essentially to find themselves in Andromeda, with your siblings' pod damaged, trapping them in cryosleep. The crew then joins up with the Pathfinder, Ryder's father, an N7 operative tasked with colonising a new world. The crew then sets out from the Ark to colonise the new world, however crash lands on the new planet, and after coming into contact with a new species known as the Ket, the team fight them off, resulting in Ryder becoming the new Initiative Pathfinder, essentially going out to colonise new worlds for the Initiative species such as the Turians, the Asari and other races from the Milky Way galaxy, basically trying to find them new planets. The main game then sets us off here, and basically sets us off on an adventure around the Andromeda Galaxy with a new ship, new squad mates, and NPCs to fight off the Ket and save Andromeda, whilst also colonising and protecting new planets for the Initiative's residents. Andromeda's main story is basically nowhere near the level of, say, Mass Effect 2 for example. The villains are extremely weak, and I didn't really feel they were threatening, or they weren't really a galaxy-wide threat, sort of like how the Reapers were in Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3. Although its really interesting premise is essentially, it just fizzles out because we only actually see 2 new alien races in the Andromeda Galaxy. You'd think we'd see a lot more, and I think that's what Andromeda's missing, because although we, start off with the interesting premise of starting out in a new galaxy, BioWare choosing to lose the Paragon Renegade system choices in favour for more simplified choices, basically having choices with a heart next to it for romance and things like that. It basically makes choices in the game feel meaningless throughout the story, because Mass Effect's biggest strong suit, other than its characters and its writing, is the multiple choice storyline. In fact, if you, for example, in Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3, if you want to be essentially evil Shepard, you can be. If you want to be a goody two-shoes sort of Boy Scout Shepard, you can be. Again, you can either play Paragon Renegade, or you can sort of meet it in a middle ground and sort of be neutral. But again, this is sadly lost here because it's gone, and it really impacts both the writing and the story as a whole. Next up is the characters, with exception to Veteran Nyx, whose story is really interesting and complex, and her backstory and background as a character is actually pretty great in my opinion. The other characters feel nowhere near the same level as characters such as Garrus, Liara, Tali, and many more from the original games. with characters like Liam being, in my opinion, one of the worst characters in a BioWare game. I mean, just listen to this.
I think I really pissed that one off. Maybe because I shot him in the face.
And again, I think this goes back to the writing. The writing for a lot of these characters is really cheesy with terrible one-liners. And yes, the original trilogy did have this, but it was done in a more satirical way, whereas certain characters would make fun of situations. For example, in Mass Effect 3's DLC, they would make fun of limitations from gameplay and game design from Mass Effect 1 and 2, and that, in my opinion, is good writing, or at least decent writing. Whereas in Mass Effect Andromeda, they'll just knock off really terrible one-liners, and it just makes no sense. And in my opinion, Mass Effect games are made better or worse by the squad mates, as these characters are the ones that you'll be spending most of the time with. And sadly, with Mass Effect Andromeda, some characters, I can't even remember their names, they're that forgettable. Not only that, but certain main crew and squad mate characters look like regular NPCs, like their character models have literally just been copy and pasted throughout the game. And their personal stories just aren't compelling enough at times, with Vetra being the exception in my opinion. In terms of gameplay, Andromeda was a radical shift for the franchise, and some of these changes for the better, and some of them not so much essentially. Andromeda takes really big inspiration from the first Mass Effect game, with more open world elements and the nomad exploration basically mirroring and echoing the exploration of the Mako from past games, whilst also still being a third-person cover-based shooter with lighter RPG elements. Firstly, the combat. I actually really liked the combat from Andromeda. I know a lot of people don't, but I found it to be fluid and resourceful, allowing Ryder, or us as a character, to become essentially a jack of all trades. If you want to have biotic powers with energy drain tech powers, you can do that. If you want soldier abilities with a portable biotic shield, you can do that. The new class system essentially lets you mix and match for more fluid combat, as well as just, again, you can really immerse yourself here, because you can say, okay, I want to be a biotic, but I also want to have tech powers, and again, you can do that. And I really like the change to this, because although you can change it with certain upgrades and whatnot, in the original trilogy you were essentially stuck with one class system. Also, I'm not going to lie, another thing that I see the game get flack for, I actually love the jet boosters. They allow for aerial dodges, and as well as faster on-foot movement. And again, I just love essentially just zipping through the air, you know, blasting like lance and just biotic powers and shooting enemies out of, like, popping in and out of cover. I think it's brilliant. But in doing this, Andromeda sadly loses the more cinematic moments achieved by Mass Effect 2 and 3. But basically, Mass Effect 2 and 3 had more linear game design, and it was designed basically as end-to-end levels, with some areas being more open, but most of them were essentially corridors, and that was fine. I believe that Mass Effect 2 and 3 are designed really well level-wise, and this led for sort of scripted cinematic moments. And although, yeah, there are some moments here and there, but Andromeda just doesn't really have any in comparison to 2 and 3. Like I said earlier though, player choice and story moments and dialogue is toned down to hell, as BioWare got rid of the Paragon Renegade system. However, I did like the introduction of things like the Omni-Tool scanner, which makes you feel like a detective scanning for blood and footprints, whilst also letting you fill out the codex when scanning things like plants, rocks, species and different weapons. In terms of multiplayer, I've only actually played a bit of Andromeda's multiplayer, both in the past few years, as well as for recording this video. But if you don't know, it's essentially a wave-based horde mode where you kill enemies to survive. Mass Effect Andromeda's multiplayer differs from past games by essentially introducing card packs, items and loot boxes. Remember, this was 2017 after all, and every game out there was essentially doing loot boxes, and it got massive flack for this, especially since the actual launch and reception of the game was not received well. Imagine what people found out when they found out there was like an in-game currency and loot boxes. They essentially went apeshit. But yeah, I enjoyed Andromeda's multiplayer, and I found it really fun. I love the overall gameplay of all the Mass Effect games, including Andromeda. I like the gameplay loop, so if you just put that into a multiplayer mode, I'm going to love it. Plus, I love Horde mode, things like Firefight from Halo or Horde mode from Gears of War. I just love that sort of mode. But the sad thing here is it did take a while to get into a match both on PC, PS5 and Xbox Series S. I did test it on all three, and it did take a while to get into a game. Weirdly enough, it did take a bit less on PS5. I don't know if it's just because people are playing it at the moment, I'm not sure, but I did get into a game sort of within a few minutes, which I think is fine, but on Xbox it did take a while. Speaking of different platforms in terms of performance, despite only running at 30 FPS and up to essentially 1440p on Xbox, Andromeda still looks great in 2023. If you're playing it on PC, for example, the game still looks and runs amazing on Ultra. I've tested it on my Razer Blade laptop and PC, and the game looks brilliant. I've got the gameplay of that on screen now. The lighting and textures look great, but sadly on console, the sluggish FPS is sort of hard to adapt to if you're used to a higher FPS. And especially in 2023, where we can play games on console at 60 FPS and 120 FPS consistently. However, you can only play 1440p on Xbox Series S and X. If you're playing on PS5, the game is locked at 30 FPS 1080p HD. And again, it depends on your personal preference. I am the type of person who prefers FPS to resolution. When I go into a game, I will put it on performance mode. However, here they haven't really gone back and tweaked anything. They've literally just made it playable on current gen, which I appreciate. But at the same time, it does take a while to adapt to. Also, whilst playing on PS5 and PC, I found that the game would randomly skip frames and stutter occasionally as well. So in conclusion, if you're looking for a similar experience to Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3, sadly it's not here. Andromeda is just not as good as the original trilogy games. The characters are weaker in terms of writing and personal stories. The performance just isn't 100% there, like I said, just with sort of frame skips and stutters and 30 FPS on console, and the villains and the writing just aren't up to par at times. But Andromeda really shines in its combat and fluidity of movement and giving the player varied choices. Two things that I hope carry over into the next Mass Effect game being obviously the fluidity of movement and the combat system. But despite all this, I put another 70 hours into Mass Effect Andromeda and 100% of the game, so I could answer the question, is Mass Effect Andromeda worth it in 2023? And the long and short of it is, yes it is. I enjoyed Andromeda and left my playthrough feeling good, basically about what I'd played, finished and accomplished, but I also felt really saddened, sort of like how in my Anthem video I felt at the end of playing that game, by all of the missed opportunities and what could have been. Because if you think about it, Andromeda did go through rough development and development hell. For example, it started off as a procedurally generated game, and then BioWare had to strip it back and strip it back and strip it back. Plus they were met with crunch from EA and deadlines which they just couldn't meet. And with its team ultimately abandoning the game very, very late in development for Anthem, which I've already done a video on how that ultimately failed and what it's like to play that in 2023 if you guys want to check that out. But I do believe that if BioWare take the combat, class options and sort of fluidity from Mass Effect Andromeda's gameplay along with the jet boosters and mix that in with the level of writing, the character design and the linear level design for Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3, then I think that the next Mass Effect game is going to be great. I think if you put all of these things together, essentially make a Mass Effect game that has all the best elements from all four games, I think BioWare have got a really good game on their hands there. But again, we'll have to wait and see. So anyway guys, thank you so much for watching my Mass Effect Andromeda video today. If you guys want to see more Mass Effect Andromeda and Mass Effect content in general, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.